Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on the SANS community. We'll be talking today about the subdivisions of Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, and Nineveh. And we're so glad that everyone could join us today. My name is Erin Tobin. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Preservation here at the Preservation League of New York State. And let me just get situated here. The Preservation League works across New York State. We're New York's historic preservation nonprofit, the statewide nonprofit, and we support community preservation efforts and advocate for effective preservation policy at all levels of government throughout the state. Well, I'm sitting here in Albany today. Our work reaches every corner of New York, stretching into communities in each one of our 62 counties, and including Long Island's East End. Our largely pro bono work really relies on contributions from generous people like you in order to protect the places that make New York so special. Places like SANS, the historic African-American vacation community that you're going to be hearing about this afternoon. Hopefully everyone attending today's webinar is a Preservation League supporter. And to those who are, thank you. To those who are not yet, I invite you to join us. And I'm going to now share my screen so you can see my presentation. There we go. So my colleagues will share a link in the chat box that you can click in order to support our work. We're focusing on SANS today for many reasons, including that it is on our 2020 and 2021 Seven to Save. Since 1999, the Preservation League has highlighted New York's threatened historic sites through our Seven to Save program, providing enhanced services from the League to bolster visibility and build support for preservation. Through partnerships with groups and individuals, we've reduced threats to dozens of at-risk buildings, landscapes, downtowns, and neighborhoods. Webinars like this one, along with media outreach, tours, grants, and advocacy are among the strategies that we employ to secure the future of these at-risk historic places. We collaborate with partners like those you'll hear from this afternoon and some who are in the audience today to craft preservation strategies and put these plans to work. Our 2020-2021 Seven to Save list helps tell the story of many people who made our state unique. They're pictured here on your screen and include a sacred burial ground, a vulnerable lighthouse, a reimagined high school, a susceptible beachside enclave, an iconic canal system, a para-architectural installation, an imperiled research center. Each site speaks to what makes our state special. And I'll say that our list goes from Geneva in New York's Finger Lakes region out to this corner of Long Island. And of course, our focus this afternoon is on the Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, and Nineveh subdivisions, known as SANS, that were developed in the mid-20th century as African-American vacation communities. The modest mid-century homes captured the spirit of the American dream and provided the backdrop for a thriving community that was knitted together by strong social bonds. And these bonds continue from its founding through today. Famous residents included poet Langston Hughes, actress Lena Horne, and more recently renowned author Colson Whitehead, who wrote the book Sag Harbor, which is featured in our inaugural book club. And hopefully you'll all meet and join us for that later next month. As SANS communities continue to age and move away, developers seeking prime waterfront property are replacing existing homes with luxury residences. Today, you'll hear from the strong group of local advocates that are spearheading preservation efforts, because despite its National Register status, SANS lacks strong local protection or zoning. The SANS development provided opportunity for African Americans to finance construction and build homes at a time when redlining was rampant. Deed restrictions and exclusionary zoning prevented African Americans from accessing waterfront. The Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, and Nineveh subdivisions provided a beach that African Americans could call their own. Define 20th century Jim Crow practices. The small lots and shady cottages of the connected SANS subdivisions create the community's character and connection, which remain largely in place, although threatened today. As developers and new property owners buy multiple lots and combine them, they seek to build massive houses over 5,000 square feet, which dramatically change the neighborhood character and sense of place. These photos demonstrate the variety of architectural styles found throughout SANS. The community isn't seeking to preserve their buildings in amber, but to manage change and make sure that what makes SANS special is not lost. The Preservation League first became engaged with the SANS community in 2017 through our NISCA partnership program, Preserve New York. With the additional support of the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, Preserve New York funded the cultural resource survey that led to the National Register designation of SANS. Only 2% of designations to the National Register of Historic Places represent African American history, which is an imbalance that reflects our country's history of racial injustice. In 2019, the New York State Office of Historic Preservation recognized the preservation efforts of the SANS Steering Committee with a statewide preservation award. In addition to the work of the Steering Committee, whose members you'll hear from today, Preservation Long Island and the New York State Historic Preservation Office have worked closely with residents to provide technical and advocacy assistance. And Preservation Long Island, whose Director of Preservation, Sarah Kautz, is in this photo, along with panelists you'll hear from today and members of the staff of the State Preservation Office, has been a key partner in preserving and helping advocates preserve the SANS community. So now I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to introduce our panelists. And once I introduce them, I'll stop my screen sharing and they will turn on their videos and you can see everybody. And it'll be perhaps a bit more personal than me talking to my computer screen. And I really look forward to this conversation. So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order as they're listed here. We have Donna Marie Barnes, who's a curator and archivist for Sylvester Manor Educational Farm, and an artist and resident of the SANS community. Malcolm Cameron, who's a PhD student at the University of Virginia. And one of the great things about Zoom is that we can have scholars from the University of Virginia zooming in with us today, so we can all be in our home communities. We have Dr. Georgette Greer-Key, who's Executive Director and Curator of the Eastville Community Historical Society, as well as a Preservation League of New York State trustee. Andrew Carl, who's Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Virginia, and Professor Carl works with Malcolm Cameron on studies of African American recreational communities. And Renee Simons, who's the president of SANS Sag Harbor. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. It's great to see you all. And I'm going to start off by asking some questions. My screen share is now off. I'm confirming. Great. I gave a very brief introduction to the community as by way of background. It's great to see you all here. I want to, I guess, we can start in any order, but my first question is to SANS Sag Harbor as to what led you to seek National Register designation? Why did you feel that that was important? And how did historic preservation become a part of your saving your community and protecting your community?
All right. Good evening, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank the Preservation League of New York also for setting this up. This is really important to us, so we appreciate it. The way we got started, actually, the way I got started was, I guess in 2015, I attended various village board meetings and committee meetings, and because there were various homes that were coming up for discussion, and I realized that scale and character, which is on the books in the code, was not really being followed nor defined. And I felt that our area was at risk in having McMansions built in our area, and there was no way to stop it. And I remember the former chair basically saying to me, if you want to stop something like that, you have to give us more reason to stop them. Meaning, if you're a historic district, then we have rules and then we can apply them. But your area is really not, basically saying it's not special enough. And when I also was faced with one of the developers saying to me one time, like, well, who are you anyway? Because I was at these meetings all the time. And what's so important about this area? Why are you trying to protect something? There's nothing there. We don't see anything there. We're doing good work by, tearing down houses and building other ones. Why wouldn't you want us to be there? And I realized two things. One, the person was not aware of what happened and how SANS came about. But also the tone of the question as an African-American and also as a woman was clearly very dismissive. So it woke me up to like, this person really doesn't understand what was here. May not be his fault, he just didn't know. But also, I'm not sure if there was an appreciation of it because of the nature of the question. So I felt that it was time to start educating people about what happened here. But I also realized that if historic district was really a critical factor, then we needed to get more information how to do that. And with that, we started investigating how to bring about that designation, starting with the village, and then moving on to the state. And because of the help that we received in the state and ultimately being acknowledged, going international. It really has made a difference in the pride that the community has had, and also the interest in maintaining investments, et cetera. But I'll leave that for later. But as your question said, what was important? I think it was important to save it. I think it was important to educate people why it was important, because most people did not know. And I believe in the case of this one question, I don't think the person actually cared. And so I thought it was important to lay some groundwork on this to prove the fact that we are important and why it was important. Without the history, a lot of people's intentions would really be dismissed and also ignored. So I think it was important for us to do.
Thank you. Dawn Marie or Georgette, do you have anything to contribute, to add to that particular question? Or
Georgette, do you want to go first? Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Just to add on to what Renee was saying about why this was important, it was important for us as a community to be recognized as such. It was also important for us culturally and historically. For me, myself, I am a lifelong Sag Harbor summer resident, a Sag Harbor baby. I'm the girl in all the pictures that Erin just showed. And for me and my family who have been here since the 50s, this is part of our tradition, it's part of our heritage. And I share that with a lot of the other families, the legacy families who have been here from the beginning and from everyone else who has come since then. What we are as a community collectively, our traditions, our attachment to the land, to the beach specifically, to the children that have grown up here for generations and the memories that they've taken away from the elders who have taught all of us everything from how to dance to how to be independent, how to share, and how to be a community. All of that needed to be preserved, acknowledged, and a format set up so that we can preserve it and pass it down. Because it's, for me, it's very important that we are a part of this village. We are part of Sag Harbor. People of color, Black people, have been a part of this village since the very beginning. We are an extension of that history, and as we move forward, and as that has to be acknowledged, and as it's looked back on, it has to be recognized and included in the telling of the whole story. So for me, that's why it was very important.
And I will just add to what Donna Marie is saying, the real importance of this extends beyond that. And it extends beyond that because to understand the history and the temporal relationships of a history to Blacks, African Americans, and a history in relation to the development of not just Sag Harbor, but to colonial America, to American history, but also the understandings of the built environment and the wealth that was attained to this history is equally important. And I think the time and understanding of this history is equally important. But also something that dropped in my head when the questions that are being asked by the people that ask these questions of Renee and also of Donna Marie. I'm thinking about James Baldwin's movie, the movie that's really playing on Netflix now, when I'm Not Your Negro. And it goes back to when he says, and I love Robert Kennedy, he's one of my heroes I talk about all the time. And he makes mention of the comment when he says, well, in 50 years, you know, we may elect a Black, an African-American. And that's what Donna Marie and all of us are saying. We've been here. And to be asked the question that in time you may, and we've been here all along since the inception, tilling the land, building the country. And we have to wait for something that, not that we should be grateful for or that we have earned, that we have made, that we have had before there were laws put in place to protect us, that we have a right, that we have contributed, that it is ours and it should be protected, it should be respected, and it should be treated the same way that other properties are protected. So to have the residents come up from the ashes without the protection in the same respect is the importance of this project, in my opinion.
If I could also add one other thing, a sense of community. I think in America today, I think more than ever because of the coronavirus, there's a greater appreciation of a sense of community. And I think that generally most neighborhoods were losing that. This is one area that maintained that for almost 70 years. When you came here, you felt you were in a community where people cared about you, who knew your name, who knew your grandmother's name, might know your classmate that you brought one summer to come summer with you. And they really cared about that. That sense of safety and sense of community, which I think everybody's running away from wherever they are to kind of find in this environment, we have it here. And there was a strong feeling that I had that we were going to lose that. One, it wasn't being respected, as I mentioned. And that two, because of that disrespect, it felt like, there was a statement that Bill Pickens actually quoted because there was a question because we were primarily African-American and some of the newer people were not. So the question came in, well, do you just don't want new people? No, we don't have a problem with integration. We have a problem with elimination. And I attribute that to the person who came up with it, William Pickens. So.
Excellent point. And I guess along those lines, my next question segues, you segued well into my next question, which is how have you seen the community evolve over the years? And what do you see as your tipping point in terms of that sense of place, understanding that, again, it's about evolution, but it's not about elimination.
Right, I think that, and I will defer, obviously Donna Marie has the long history, but I will say what I've seen. I came here when I was in college, and it was a place to go, come with other, college mates and sororities and, fraternal brothers and really play in the SANS, so to speak, and have a good time. I actually didn't come back again until 2003 when I was looking to actually settle, because I always went to Martha's Vineyard, and I said, there's something here and I miss it. Let's find it in Sag Harbor, and we did. What changed, I believe, even from that period to the 2015 that I cited, was, I think, a generational change. It happens in all cultures, in all environments, in all neighborhoods, where kids who were raised there kind of in their 20s and 30s tend to look at other places. So you had those who were older who were actually tending to retire here, and those who were in the millennials, et cetera, are kind of traveling around trying to find a place for them. What is interesting to me today versus that one kind of 10-year period is that I see a direct and strong resurgence of those generations now understanding and taking pride in the history, that this wasn't given to us. This was earned, this was founded, this was developed, this was special. And now, because I think the current environment we're in has underscored how special the sense of community is. And so I think there's a savoring of that today. But there was a period where generationally it slowed, but I see a definite difference. And now I'll defer to Donna Marie.
Thanks, Renee. Obviously, there's the natural change and progress and evolution, as Renee said. We've gone from the roads not being paved to paved roads to not having cable. So, which may sound like a small thing, but if you think that there were only 3 stations to watch on television, that wasn't what you spent your time doing. And so everybody was outside. Children were outside from the moment that they woke up to the moment that they were called in for dinner and then afterwards. So there was a greater sense of being a part of the actual land because there were fewer houses and the developments were connected through the woods, which we ran across something that we refer to as the Indian trails, because that's what our parents and grandparents told us that they were, the ancient trails of the native people, which in fact they are. Those were our roadways that we could go from Nineveh to Azurest through the woods and never step on pavement. And as Renee said, as time went on, the roads were paved, we got cable, there was internet, things naturally change. Children grow up, they stop coming, they have other interests. But I do see, and I do agree that in this time, in this moment that we're in this summer, especially, there is a change. And perhaps it has to do with our entering into this atmosphere of getting these designations, of taking a moment to critically look at what our history is, to recognize it as unique. There is a certain pride, I feel, that we all are feeling, that we are something special. I think generationally too, I see many more young people coming whose families have been here for a long time, who have a resurgence of the pride of being here and the responsibility of being a homeowner and what that means. I see it within my own family with my son and my nephew. They have an ownership of this place and have made a commitment that this is their home, that they will always maintain for us, that this is their, for lack of a better word, their ancestral home. And I see that across all of the developments. And I think that part of that is because of the recognition that we've gotten and the importance that everyone is seeing of what this really truly means for us and for the state and for the nation in this time.
And from an institutional standpoint of view, I see the waves in the change. So in 1994, from an institutional point of view, we noted that when the expansion was done to include Eastville in the expansion, we made note that it should be paid attention to and looked at from the village. In 2009, also there was reference to there should be some attention paid to the developments. Again, in 2012, there was also made some reference to that there is some changes here that we should be looking at. So it feels like it was overnight, but I think that there were, of course, institutionalized from Eastville's standpoint that we were looking at the changes that were happening. And of course, to what Renee and Donna Marie was saying, of course, generationally changes did happen. I'm just happy now that we are in a different place and all of the work that the community and the residents have done to bring us where we are, and make no mistake about it. This is definitely a grassroots effort, and many of the committee, the steering committee and the residents and the leadership of Renee who have, and the elders. What can I say about the elders? I get chills just thinking about them and what they have done. And as Donna Marie said, what's important here, without them, you know, you think I have to correct students a lot when they come to us, because if something is almost said, oh, we'll just say that it's folklore or it's oral history. I have done a lot of work to make sure to tell them that you do a disservice when you just pass something off as, oh, it's folklore, because as Donna Marie said, and indeed it was, because we have to make sure that what they're telling us, that it's passed down and it's true. And that's been a driving point to a lot of the research that we've done. So it's just a real process that we really appreciate. And I'm just glad that we have the institutional information to help us move forward. So it's been a real driving force for us. But we recognize that there has been a wave in the changes that have happened over the years, but we recognize it periodically over time.
Thank you. That's also a good segue into reaching out to Malcolm and Andrew here, who are the scholars at the University of Virginia, and working on, speaking of research and context, working on a National Park Service context study for African-American recreational sites nationally. And could you, one or both of you, talk about that research and how SANS fits into that national context? How many places like SANS remain, and how have you seen other African-American vacation communities deal with the development pressures that SANS face?
Sure, I can start, and let me just first begin by saying hello to Renee and Georgette and Donna Marie. It is so nice to see you. I wish I was up there right now. It's just so nice to hear again. Also, your work and your tireless efforts there have really remained a constant source of inspiration for me, and keep driving me to continue the work that we're doing. And it's just really nice to just be able to reconnect even from afar. But so I'm a historian, and Malcolm and I, Malcolm is a graduate student at the University of Virginia and is working as a graduate research assistant for this National Park Service project that I'm serving as the principal investigator for. And it is focused on situating the African-American outdoor recreational experience within the larger history of outdoor recreation and the parks system in America. And for me, and I'll let Malcolm say here in a moment a little bit more about the elements of that, the work that we're carrying out. But I'll just say that my research, and I've been doing writing about the history of African-American leisure spaces and land ownership in the 20th century in a variety of different capacities, very, very much focused on the history of coastal land ownership, and over a long century that has seen many changes to coastal areas, both in terms of who lives there, how they've been developed, how they've been redeveloped, and how they've faced threats both from politically, economically, and environmentally. How specifically how African-American communities such as SANS have worked to both preserve their history and preserve the meaning of these of the very rich tapestry of life that both Renee, Donna Marie, and Georgette so powerfully conveyed at the outset. And I'll just say, I see SANS as part of, and its history as part of this broader struggle of generations of African Americans seeking to develop and defend their own leisure spaces, places where they could live in dignity and enjoy moments of leisure on their own terms, and find momentary reprieve from a racist society. This is, in so many ways we can look at the history of places like SANS from their origins in the early to mid 20th century up to the present as being very much a critical part of the larger story of African Americans in America and really American history. The story of places like SANS and many and the countless numbers of other African American summer communities, coastal resorts, as being very much reflective of the diversity of Black America itself and the various ways in which leisure and pleasure was pursued in America, and in particular, the ways in which it was being pursued and defended by African Americans, both from the Jim Crow era through the modern day, of where the threat of redevelopment, the threat of gentrification is become, and as well the threat of climate change that is posing existential challenges to coastal communities. And one thing that as we've worked on this project and I've written about the history of African American beach communities, the one thing that stands out at all stages is how how diverse these spaces are and remain. We've put together and compiled lists of all the different places that African-American communities built over the 20th century, and they run the gamut from religious campgrounds to places for secular amusement, from exclusive communities that were homes to African-American professionals from cities, to places that were primarily retreats for working families. But the one thing that many of them had in common was that ownership of the land and that real powerful sense of place and attachment to the land, and a sense of what land ownership and property meant in the broader struggle for freedom. And here I think as well is one where we can see the threat that communities like SANS face right now is being tied to a larger set of threats that are facing many historically Black communities, not just in coastal areas, not just summer communities, but one that we're seeing play out across urban America today. And how this is one that really speaks to a point that Renee made so powerfully earlier about why history matters. Just that comment she said where someone said, that SANS isn't special enough. Well, that's part of the work that Renee and Georgette and Donna Marie have been doing, is to show that this history is not just special. I mean, it is critically important and one that is worth preserving. And in many ways, again, this is what historically white communities have been doing for years. In fact, they probably don't even have to, because it's assumed that their history is important. And so that requires more sort of being forthright and being proactive in protecting that history. And I'll just say, just to give one example of this, and I think one that can perhaps offer a model for thinking about how why some historically Black summer communities and beach resorts have been able to persevere, and why others haven't. And I think, one, and they all have important histories to tell and important elements to preserve and maintain, but being forthright in historic preservation and putting that public history together and telling it to many audiences. Not, I write books and write essays, but there's many different ways to communicate this history. And one that stood out to me in the course of writing my first book, The Land Was Ours, which very much tells the story of African-American beach communities that formed in the coastal South from the era of Jim Crow through the Civil Rights era. And many of these places succumb to redevelopment, succumb to various forms of legalized theft, often at the hands of speculators and developers and public officials who often did their bidding. But those that were able to maintain their integrity and maintain the community were ones that were very protective and very proactive in telling their story. So one in particular that I'll just mention is Highland Beach in Maryland. This was one of the first African-American coastal communities, resort and cottage communities founded in the South. It was founded in the late 19th century by the children of Frederick Douglass. In fact, the first house built at Highland Beach was a cottage built for Frederick Douglass. He passed away just before it was completed, so he never got to live in the cottage, but that stood there at the center of this community that was perched right there on the Chesapeake, looking out at the waters, looking over across to the eastern shore where Frederick Douglass himself escaped from slavery. And that became the anchor of the community. And when we got to the 1970s, after desegregation, after places like the western shore of Maryland began to be, a hot commodity for second homes for people living in DC or Baltimore, after it became something that real estate developers began to eye, and after many other Black communities that had been formed along the Chesapeake had succumbed to redevelopment, Highland Beach rallied around their history. They rallied around the story that it told about Black America from emancipation to the present. It rallied around that piece of property, the home that was built for Frederick Douglass. I remember, talking, sitting on the front porch of Ray Langston, who was a descendant of John Mercer Langston, one of the congressmen during Reconstruction. I mean, a living link to this, African-American past. And he talked about how, as they began to feel the pressure of development and as they began to see houses in neighboring communities get bought and then torn down and replaced with a McMansion that, as Renee was describing, they said, look, we need to defend first this place. We got to protect the Douglas home. We cannot, and they worked to get that put as a historic landmark, designated as a place that was a very important historical significance. And in many ways and succeeded in doing that. And in many ways that marked that place and that community as one that was linked to a longer history. It in many ways retained families who might have otherwise have drifted away or sold their property, and instead kind of kept families coming back and kept them more dogged in their determination to preserve what was so important to generations of children and families who grew up there. And in many respects, that remains today. Highland Beach remains in many of the families who were there, and new families have come in. And I think, again, as we were saying, it's not about just kind of stopping history in its tracks. It's about both evolving over time, but also remembering what's important to preserve and keeping those links to the past. And Highland Beach today remains a community that is very welcoming to anyone, but it's also one that is very rooted in its African-American past. And that, I think, is one that offers an important lesson as we're thinking through here what the threats that places like SANS face and also what routes forward toward its preservation.
Thank you. That was a very helpful overview and great to hear about that example. And it sounds like that's the direction that SANS is moving towards with the designation. Malcolm, could you talk a bit about your work with the Park Service context statement and what your goals from that project are?
Yeah, absolutely. So the National Park Service, with the help of the Organization of American Historians, is undertaking a context study to study or to examine how race shaped the African Americans, to examine how race shaped African Americans' experience with recreation and the outdoors. So the study spans the years 1865 to basically the present, and it examines a number of factors like how African Americans sorted out outdoor recreation as the nation sort of kind of wrestled with Black freedom and citizenship following the Civil War, and also how African Americans increasingly demanded access to public accommodations, such as places of outdoor recreation during the modern civil rights movement. So in telling this expansive story, the study highlights African Americans' relationships to various places like playgrounds, pools, parks, camps, beaches, resorts, and communities like Sag Harbor. There are a number of books and resources about individual communities, but this study is one of the few research efforts that attempts to sort of kind of weave all of these stories together. So the National Park Service is particularly interested in this project because, as many people on this call may be aware, African Americans have a very complicated history with national parks. The hope is that the study can help the Park Service improve how it talks about African American history and how it shares the African American outdoor experience with a larger audience. So to that end, as part of the project, we are developing a digital experience aimed towards high school students. The website will highlight several African American recreational sites across the country. And I believe we're well over 200 or so now. And it will also include oral histories, photos, maps, stories, all about the Black experience in the outdoors. And then finally, the information gathered from the context study will be used to recommend 3 sites of African American outdoor recreation and leisure for National Historic Landmark status.
That's wonderful. And is that a website that's under development, or is that something that's live now?
So the website is currently under development. We've made a tremendous amount of progress, but there still is a little bit more work to do.
Wonderful. Well, look, we'll make sure to, when it's ready for sharing, we'll make sure to share that and publicize it.
My perspective for SANS, I know the SANS would be very excited about that. It also provides a national context I don't think many people realize that while we were in distinct areas, there wasn't and there's a storm happening. I keep looking. If you see thunder and lightning, that's what's going on. There's an interrelatedness in some respects. Now, not that everybody went to all of them, but there was somebody or a thread or a family member. So there is a connectedness across a lot of these areas, both in time and in the same time and location. So this is exciting.
That's wonderful. So my question will then lead into my final question, and then we'll lead into, we have questions that have popped up in chat as well as in the Q&A, is really what's next. What does SANS Sag Harbor see as the next steps, and what you're doing to protect the community. There was a question that I can answer very quickly that came up in the chat about whether it's locally designated. And it is not, does not fall under a local historic preservation ordinance. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. And that might get to the heart of your advocacy on behalf of SANS.
Yes, hope you can hear. Okay, so yes, we realized this was like a three-legged stool, and we had the state and national historic listing, and it begged the question, what about the local one? And the local area is important because that's where the teeth lie, so to speak, in terms of what will happen to preserve it over time. Without that, it runs the risk of being eliminated slowly. And just to tell you that it can happen, used to be 5 areas within the African-American community in the mid-century. And one of which was Hillcrest Terrace. That is no longer functioning. The association is not functioning, and even the signage has been removed. So things can disappear in time. So one of the 5 is definitely gone. So what we are trying to do is try to come to a place where we can get local designation that creates a win-win for those who live here and own here, and also a win for the future and history. We realized there are some smaller homes that were very cottage built, and I should make a point about the size of homes. These houses, if you just drive in, seem quite modest, etc. It's not that the people who own them, remember, these are second homes. It's not that the people who own them could not make the decision, all right, I'm gonna build a bigger home. At the time they started, people's egos is a statement that we use in corporate world. You leave your ego at the door. And in many ways, I think when we all passed the bridges, et cetera, coming here that had the water paths, as soon as we came over, it's like the ego and all of the structure really fell out of bed. And we were not defined by the size of the house. As was mentioned with Donna Marie, most time was spent out of doors because of the interacting and just being out of doors. You only used your home to sleep in, and that was it. There was more interaction across relationships. So with that said, and to the point of we don't want to freeze in time, we do want to manage the change. We have to create a win where we're managing the change, and we are achieving the teeth that we need to ensure that these entities will continue to exist beyond my lifetime, and into as long as we can as an entity. Not that the same people will be there, even maybe the same families, but at least there'll be an intrinsic valuing of that history and a valuing of the worth, the phenomenal pioneering attitude, and the fact that we were able to sustain it with that sense of community for a very long time. I mean, we're in America, so it may not be the same sense of community. Clearly today is different than it was even 5 years ago in terms of a sense of community around America. So let alone one little place like SANS. But our hope is that it would have a spirit that would be envied and maintained throughout time. But we will need to have a local designation of some sorts in order to manage that. And our goal is to try to do that, as well as in that process, create a certain amount of transparency with residents. So it is something that there is more participatory. And as an old saying says that, you know, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock and it landed on us. We don't want this to feel as though it's landing on them. Okay.
Thank you. I think that again segues into some of the questions. I'm gonna ask some questions that have come up in the Q&A box in the chat box for you. And there's some I may combine some that have a similar theme, but there's questions about transfer of property across the generations. So there's one about distribution of wealth and interference of legacy wealth in terms of inheriting family land, and questions about what to do in terms of property sales, and you know, what to do when families are considering selling, and talking about the importance of the community. So how is that perhaps factored into your efforts?
Okay, so let me just start with something that we did do, and I'm going to turn it, I guess maybe Donna Marie or someone else, or I don't know whether who else wants to pick it up. About maybe 8 years or so ago, we actually had a seminar here and we brought in financial investment people and also a lawyer to talk about wealth management, and also how do you pass it on legally with wills and estate planning and things of that nature. It was a long time ago, and I don't think that it may today be so much. I think people attended, we had a huge crowd, but we need to do it again. I think we need to do it again sooner versus later. It is one thing that not just this environment, but all environments, people really don't pay much attention. It particularly hurts African Americans nationally, particularly in areas, and actually Andrew Kelly is a better expert on this, but recently I just had a conversation with someone who was subject to heir laws, where in the South, basically, if you don't write wills and you have 5 kids and they each have 5 kids, by the time you get 2 or 3 generations down and there's no will, there's a question about the title. And once there's a title issue, if you have 30 people saying, but I have a piece of it, there are now heir laws that will force, if one person out of 100 or 1 out of 5 says, but I want my share now in cash, they can force the sale of a home. And all the 30 or 150 people will be forced to lose that heritage property that it may be in 1 acre. In many cases, sometimes it's 100 acres that they are now forced to sell. And the curious part of it, there's always a developer willing to buy. And also there are circumstances where that one person will say, well, I don't want it to be a hardship for the other 99. I just want my money. And somehow they can sell it to a third party who said, well, I'll just buy your 1 share and I'll buy you out. But what then happens, they then in time force the sale of the 150 people, and the property then is bought up under that circumstance. But I'll defer to Andrew on that. I just want to leave everyone who's on the line know that this is on our mind. We got to do this. It's not something that historically African Americans like talking about. You know, it goes back into a lot of mores and stuff. You don't want to talk about that. I'm not going to be here. The one thing I know for sure, because I've worked a little bit in investment banking with private banking, rich people do this all the time, and they start their kids writing wills at 16 because they want to make sure the government doesn't get the money. So this 16-year-old has no problem writing a will. And so we need to make sure that we are better prepared. So I'll go to Andrew, and maybe someone else wants to chime in.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, Renee's absolutely right. I mean, the issue of heirs property and this, what happens when you die without leaving a will, and then it kind of goes down to your children and children's children and these undivided shares, has been one of the principal instruments of Black land loss nationwide over the course of the 20th century, and continues to be a real threat in many states. And I'll say here's some good news. I was just actually, as Renee mentioned that, I was looking online. The state of New York actually passed this year a uniform code for heirs property partition. And this has been a nationwide effort to enact laws at the state level that prevent the types of abuses that Renee was just describing, whereby speculators can swoop in, buy a share of a piece of property that doesn't have in which there's no clear title because the original owner died without a will. Again, this is something that many developers have used to wrest a hold of valuable property against the family's wishes. Fortunately, in New York now, there are guardrails put in place that are aimed at protecting families that are threatened by this. But I should also mention, you know, one of the other, even that law, which has made it, done a lot to help prevent some of the worst abuses, still can't address some of these other challenges that oftentimes put families in the position where they're struggling to hold to resolve disputes, namely rising property taxes. I mean, property taxes become one of the real sort of issues, especially in these areas where you see real estate values exploding, which again, is great for someone who wants to sell their land, but is not great for especially a family on a fixed income where they're seeing their annual property taxes continue to escalate. And that oftentimes can push a family to the brink, where then you see disputes emerge over whether to hold on or to sell. So I think we still have a lot of work to do to both address some of the underlying conditions that put families in these types of spots where there's a real sort of struggle to hold on to the land, even outside of the kind of predatory tactics used by developers.
Right, and there are alternatives to just even selling. There are, you know, with connections, I don't want to recommend one or another because it really is up to individual people, but there are ways that you can figure out a way to finance like an upgrade to your place. So if you want to rent your place to kind of sustain it while you're not there or can't afford it, then you have to have new bathrooms, new kitchens. But don't sell your house because you don't want to do the bathroom or kitchen to get the rental. You give it to somebody else to make the $300, $400, $500, $600 million, $600,000 profit on it. There's a way that you can work around there. People in SANS who can give you information how to manage that. So you're not alone, and there are people who are willing to help you to keep it in your family. The one thing my grandfather always said, and you know this is because your grandparents said the same thing, they're not inventing land. There's no new land. Land does not lose value. So if you can hold on to it, it's a good thing. You can even use it to leverage to buy other things. There's a lot of things, and there are a lot of financial people here who can help guide you through that. And I know we do probably owe another seminar or two to kind of get to those points.
There's a couple questions that relate to the benefits of historic designation and you know, what that means, architectural restrictions. You know, I think we've touched on that a little bit, and the reasons why SANS was listed and the importance of that designation, and what it means to be historic, that this is in fact a historic community, and it's not looking to be preserved in amber. Let's see, Georgette, just do you want to say a few words about the preservation efforts and the benefits of preservation, and that this isn't about restricting you know, what color people paint their house. It's about preventing the collection of 5 lots and building a 6,000 square foot house, perhaps.
Well, I just think I've been reading through the chats. I see a lot of things that are misconceptions and misinformed information. And I really don't want to go into that. But first of all, some of the people are saying that there aren't any architectural merits to the houses, which is completely not true. I think not enough people really understand mid-modern century homes. That's the first thing I'd like to clear up. I'd also like to go to the fact to say that let's not forget Mesa, Meredith, and Elsie Gale, that's also important to say that this community was founded by women, and we are celebrating the 100th centennial of women getting the rights to vote. And going back to the Eastville community, where women own land, and the reason why this community is possible because of the historic Eastville community, which also fought to be included in the Sag Harbor expanded district, which was left out of history as well. So I think that's very important to talk about the fact that women must be included in this story as well as a minority, and also the Native Americans, the biopic inclusion in this story. So we need to talk about that too. So when people think about that, and there also was a statement as if we are doing this purely as a result, it was created because of segregation. No, it was not created because of segregation. Most people don't understand the first time that we have the Civil Rights Act is in 1954. Well, let's do a history lesson. When was the first civil rights law enacted, Andrew? 1954, right? So when you think of it in terms of housing, so when was these houses built? They were built before we had laws that protect us from discriminatory things concerning mortgages, et cetera, et cetera. So this was before that time. So no, it wasn't around segregation. It's not like Levittown and other places on Long Island that we know of that had covenants, and also a part of our government that also partook and used public money to discriminate against African Americans. Our government and our banks that use our public dollars that also discriminated against our veterans who also fought for this country. So we're not doing that. We're not saying that. It's not that. But those are the type of comments that were in the chat. So absolutely, we have been including everyone. This story that we're doing is we're righting a wrong in the history that has been omitted purposefully and that is being blocked. So this is not a revision of history. This is a correction. This is a footnote in the history. That's what we're trying to do here. And with that being said, SANS absolutely should be included as mid-modern century houses that was built in a time of opposition, and they didn't make us think about it. They just went about their business in a time where second homes for many people, they didn't even have money to do it, but these African Americans absolutely did it without fuss, with not having any loans on their own. Some people built their houses over time, and we just want the recognition that we need. We're not trying to restrict others from doing it. If you want to build your house, this is the time for everyone to come to the table and say, this is what we'd like to see happen in our community. This is a collective time for us all to come together and say, this is the code that we would like to see. We are not looking at the restrictive of some of the captain's houses that are in the village. We're working together with all of the resources that we have. So it's been a long time. And of course, Long Island, we see that African Americans are not representative in the built environment. We've been working very long and hard with the Preservation League of New York State, who has been a pillar and a partner for advocacy across Long Island. And we thank Andrew Hall and many of the advocates that have been there for us for a very long time. It's a long feat. The work that we're doing, it's a tireless work, but I think that the understanding when we see something that is beautiful, it's not always the grandiose historic architecture that you see that is the only architecture that's there. What about the slave cabin structures that we see? What about the monuments and community squares? There are elements and different things that we have to look at, and that must be included. There were other people that were here. What about land itself? How do we look at preservation today and make sure that everyone's story is included? There are different elements that are included and all respected. So that's all I have to add, Erin.
I'm gonna, if I could just speak to some benefits, if you don't mind, I'm gonna just go down and kind of look. I have a list. I want to make sure I don't miss any, because I think it's one question that people recurringly ask. One, it provides the benefits of a local village historic district designation. It does provide potentially, we're looking to see some type of tax credits for some legacy homes. And I know there are preambles, whether it's on the national level, like you might have to have it on a commercial basis versus purely residential. It discourages McMansion development because it does have some rules. It helps appreciate at a rate greater than local market rates in other similar areas. We do know it holds the market value better. It protects the investment of historic property owners and residents. It also has marketing status. I noticed that even developers now are using historically important SANS area in their rental advertisements for their property, and where they want to charge $150,000 per month. So there must be something to that. It preserves rarely available African-American history. It was already mentioned that African-American history items or entries are like 2% of the national listing, which I don't think, Erin, may not have mentioned that it's over 95,000 entries. And of those 95,000 entries, they're only 2%. And SANS is one of them. So we have something to be proud of. It prevents the elimination of character and the dilution, which would eviscerate the living history, meaning we have it now, but if it's eviscerated or gone or demolished, we won't have it anymore. We can lose what we are cherishing in national and state designation. And it really underscores SANS as a vehicle for education and prevents deterioration of its integrity. Malcolm, you mentioned about this website. Having that website out there where students, African-American, brown students, all students, white students, worldwide students can learn about what has happened here. The one thing that has always been missing in our American history has been African American history. We forget how much what was done and the labor and the contributions that were made are somehow just ignored, basically. And that history, here's a time that we can try to retain something. We're one of the last few intact recreational areas in America. And Andrew, I will defer to you with that, because I remember one time when you spoke before, I said, how many are, he's over 100. And I said, how many may exist now? I don't think there are many. I know they're not many. And I don't think many have a private beach that they own. But Andrew? Am I correct on that? I think other things like it educates Americans about the cultural areas. It's all about education, preservation of what is special about us. I think we should care about it. I don't think history should be disposable.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, not only do we need to know more African-American history, we need to recognize that African-American history is American history, and that you cannot understand American history without understanding the experiences, struggles, and triumphs of African-Americans. And just to reiterate something that Georgette said earlier, and I cannot emphasize this enough, she is absolutely correct. I mean, we need to think differently about what is architecturally significant and what is worthy of preservation. Because when I look at houses that were built in SANS by African Americans at a time where banks routinely, systematically discriminated against Black borrowers, at the same time as that lenders and the federal government were bankrolling places like Levittown and bankrolling suburban communities. Every one of those properties that I see there, I see sweat equity. I see people who put every bit of their energy and without financing, without the kind of assistance that white home builders were getting. And I see there a kind of a unique and powerful story of resilience, of determination, and of a story of how communities were built without all of the sort of forms of assistance that were being provided to other Americans. And that alone tells a powerful, incredibly powerful story that transcends, whatever architectural features we might be looking at. I think we need to actually put architecture within its social and historical context. And if you sort of think of it broadly in that sense, then these are some of the most important pieces of, in the built environment for preserving. And it remains a tragedy that we kind of have allowed so many of them to slip out of our hands. And also as well that we continue to kind of look in kind of in a narrow way at what is deemed of historic significance, because I think every piece of property there, everything that has been built over time there really speaks to an important story that is should be of interest to all Americans.
And I just want to add to, when I teach about Levittown, I also teach the fact that it should be looked at as affordable housing project, because not only was it an affordable housing project, the other thing that is important too is that it absolutely used the zoning laws to get rid of the basement, and they had the veterans go down to the town hall and get rid of and advocate to get rid of the zoning law to get rid of the basement, because that's the only thing that made it now affordable, because they thereby get rid of the $12,000 cost of pouring the cement for the basement. And that leads me to my other point of all of what we're talking about. Yes, we have to talk about the history, which is important in regards to preservation. But let us not forget, like me and my colleague, Sarah Kautz from Preserve Long Island, who was on the call as a participant. We constantly talk about a big part of preservation is the civics and the residents' ability to be part of engagement and the civics involved with the local government. And thereby the local government has and duty and to be involved with the residents' right to participate with the governments and say what it is they want and how the local government responds. And we thereby need to make sure that the local government hears and act upon their own laws, their own ordinances and zones, and do what it is that's on their own books. And that means for all of the residents, not for some or certain communities. Here on Long Island, we have this saying, if George Washington slept in there or did you know what, it would be saved. And thereby it is no longer fair or acceptable that only certain people or certain things get saved or held at a higher light. The time is now.
That is the perfect way to wrap up this discussion. We've run a bit over, but I'm so glad we did. And I think this discussion and the points that have been made deal with something that historic preservation as a movement is increasingly coming to terms with, as they should, and it's about what they define as historic, as a movement, define as architecturally important and historically significant. And I think that it really, what the efforts of SANS Sag Harbor and other historic African-American communities point out, that we all have a long way to go in this field of making sure that we tell a complete story and that we recognize the complete history, because it's it's a history that if it were perhaps a white history, this wouldn't be quite the same struggle in terms of how Renee started off with that question. Well, why is SANS important? It should be pretty obvious why SANS is important. So I'm going to just, with that, I'm going to close and share my screen again to say thank you to everybody who has joined us today, to just deeply, deeply thank our panelists. It's been my honor to get to moderate this discussion and to hear from all of you who are have such extensive insight and knowledge and experience. And so thank you as panelists for taking the time to share your background and your expertise and your knowledge with us. And on your screen, you can see the ways that you can become connected or stay connected with the Preservation League. Underscoring that power of community partnership, we rely on all of you to support us, and your voice makes a difference. Your financial support makes a difference. So if you wouldn't mind, if you enjoyed this program, please consider contributing what you can. We appreciate it. Also, contribute to your local organizations like SANSAC Harbor and Preservation Long Island. We all work together, and we all are part of the web that creates these and supports these community connections. So thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. You can, on our website, if you don't get our emails, you can subscribe to our email updates or join us on social media. And thank you all. Have a really wonderful evening.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.